This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
Hey everybody, this is Razib with the Unsupervised Learning Podcast, and I'm here to talk to Nikolai Yakovenko. He is a returning guest. I can't even count how many times he's been on the podcast the last couple of years, and the main reason he is on is we often talk about artificial intelligence, AI, AGI, PDOOM, all of these things that have been kind of in the discourse floating around. And, it's just a big deal right now, in my opinion. And therefore, I think it's useful to talk to Nikolai as a practitioner in the field. He's been in the field in various ways for a decade, ex-NVIDIA, way back. He was at Google. He was also at Twitter when it was called Twitter. And more recently, he has been an entrepreneur in the AI as well as crypto fields. He has his hands in a lot of different things. He is right now the CEO of Deep News with a Z. It's a really great application that helps summarize the news and keeps you abreast of what's going on in the world. So get it on your phone, download the app, or get it on the browser. We'll have the links there. We'll talk a little bit about what building Deep News has kind of taught Nikolai about AI as a practitioner in the current moment, as opposed to the theory of what's going on. And before we get into that, Nikolai, it's been a couple of years. We did do an informational podcast a while ago, but I do have new listeners, believe it or not. So some people might not actually know what AI is and why it's a big deal and why we keep talking about LLMs, large language models. Can you just tell the listener real quickly, okay, like in the generality, this is AI, and then we have these large language models specifically, and why they became a big deal over the last couple of years, and why they are so much more powerful than the other types of AI that we had in the past. And a lot of it has to do with neural networks. A lot of it has to do with unexpected scaling properties, et cetera, et cetera. Let's just get a little bit into that in the beginning so that people know a little beyond the jargon.
Yes. Hi, Razib. So I guess we'll just say AI is simple in that you're saying, hey, I want the machines to, make human-like decisions or to do, sort of human-like things. So here's and the biggest sort of insight was that after, decades of sort of doing a lot of design and procedurally explaining the problem, that sort of stuff, essentially these were small data problems, right? And, you remember when big data was a buzzword? Well, it was mostly bullshit, but it turns out that actually a lot of data, even noisy, sort of medium quality data, was the better way to train these AIs. The way that they're trained, but most famously, like you said, the LLMs, the large language models, is you give it a huge amount of text, you do some quality checks, whatever, we can get into that. But relatively straightforward, you just sort of take all the decent stuff on the internet, for example, and you train the model in a very simple task of predicting the next word. And some people would even refer to that as unlabeled data, but I mean, it is labeled essentially, but you're just doing the most rudimentary task, predict the next word, predict the next sentence, that sort of thing. And it turns out that does scale incredibly well, although some are arguing now that we're running into some scaling issues. So we'll sort of get into that in a second. But basically, it's the culmination of this work where you said, hey, whether it's a chess game and you just predict the next move, and the model sort of, basically fits a neural net, which is basically like a universal function approximator. It's something that can sort of model anything, let's just say. Let's not worry about that for too much. Well, it's that is the best way to train, a robot to play chess, something to play poker, but mostly these language models. Now, the games do have one important caveat, which is sort of the crux of this problem, where the first really good models for something like chess or poker would learn from, games of good players and learn to imitate them. And believe it or not, you can actually scale it to where they play better than the original games they were imitating. But then they were like, hey, since since it's a constrained game, you can sort of have it play itself, introduce the variants, try different moves, and basically the computers will play each other, and you have this like runaway success problem. Now, obviously, as you can imagine, that has not really happened with other models, particularly language. Although we do some of that now, which I think we'll get into as well. Is that a pretty good start?
Yeah, yeah. And so I think one of the questions, or one of the topics that I do want to touch on, and there's been a few things like Understanding AI, I think wrote that Substack by Tim Lee wrote about the kind of like the second wave of connectionism that kind of started around 2010. So just I read some stuff about connectionism and neural networks, I think like early 2000s, and I think it was by Gary Marcus, who is right now kind of has a second career as an AI naysayer.
Yeah, he's the number one hater at the moment.
He is the hater. He is the anti-pope, and he would kind of like poo-pooed the future of neural networks. They had like a big, they had like a period in the 70s or 80s, I guess, that they were a big deal, and then they kind of like ran into problems, and then they deep learning, another term associated with these neural networks, these layers and stuff like that. This all kind of comes to the fore in the last decade, and then LLMs. And I guess from an outsider's perspective, one of the things that is notable is it seems to me how unpredictable this has been, insofar as you read what people said 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, and they're very, very far off compared to where they are right now, I feel. And for example, NVIDIA famously went all in on GPUs. And that's why they're a big deal, because artificial intelligence, really compute intensive. It runs on GPUs. And Intel, I'm reading articles about how Intel, the national champion a decade ago, is possibly going to get a government bailout because they're not very optimized to manufacture GPUs. So there was no anticipation a decade ago, even in a place like Intel, where like they're supposedly smart people, they're supposedly smart executives, but they had no idea. How did this? I mean, am I wrong in terms of the lack of foresight? Did some people internally kind of see it, and word didn't just get out? Like, give me a clarity on that.
Well, it's very complicated. I think it's tying into sort of too many things to address, to be honest. But let's try a couple. I mean, so first of all, yeah, it's hard to predict the future. I think we know that when people get it right, but it's kind of random. I mean, I think of it a little more as a trader, where you can look at things like momentum and extrapolation, but you can't extrapolate very far. So even take something like the weather, predicting hurricanes, which, by the way, that has gotten way better than 20 years ago by like a tremendous amount. But just take that problem, right? You can sort of, okay, if the hurricane's building, you can say it might get bigger, it might get smaller. If it's on a path, you can see the momentum. So I don't really necessarily think NVIDIA did anything more than that. I mean, obviously Jensen, organizationally put enough resources behind it. Even when I was at NVIDIA, I mean, certainly most people were not working on, I mean, it's a GPU company. Most people were not working on deep learning. I mean, it was a big thing, but, people were doing other problems and this and that. And, I mean, famously, the GPUs were used to train ConvNets, which is technology nobody even uses anymore, but they were probably the first big breakthrough for deep learning for computer vision. And that was like one of 10 or 12 problems that they supported. And it was not anyone's number one problem. So, if you want to sort of believe their narrative or sort of these just so stories, it's like, well, they supported 12 things and it worked out, right? So it's kind of a classical problem where you invest into multiple things, and often the biggest one isn't the one that is as cool. I mean, even when I was at Google 20 years ago, the two sort of non-Google problems that Google supported, back then it was Google, not Alphabet, right? The two problems that they were very supportive was the genomics, like Craig Venter project, and the self-driving project that at the time was run out of Carnegie Mellon. Both of those sort of ended up working out and being big, but in very different ways and very different trajectories. And I think if you follow the path of those things, they've crossed several times. I mean, certainly there was definitely a time not long ago when self-driving things seemed way more significant than some of the genomic stuff. Okay, maybe that also got dragged out. That's taken longer, but now you have Waymos. I think a lot of the genomics stuff is, it's just going to take longer as well. We need to sequence more people or whatever. I mean, you're the expert on that. So it's the truth is, with research, nobody knows. Nobody knows, and And the problem also is when you're a researcher, you know, like how do you get out? How do you get resources? And should you get resources? Like deep learning was already well into the upswing. So there was a lot of momentum when we were there. So we did well. But, you know, our big LLM, which is basically our attempt to, to replicate and improve on GPT-3 or even GPT-2, I guess, it was a big deal to get resources for that. We got it. My boss deserves a lot of credit, but it was a very big deal to get sort of time on NVIDIA's internal computer cluster. And in order to scale it that big, to train a 11 billion parameter model, which was briefly the largest model ever trained, I mean, it was a very big deal to set that up, to have the people motivated to do it, the resources. So, you can't, you just can't know. And then obviously after the fact, I mean, a year or two later, it's like, oh my God, this was the most obvious decision of all time,
Yeah. Well, so, we've been talking like a high level abstraction here. And, I want to loop back a little bit about the technology at some point in terms of like the more macro social, implications. And mostly I want to get your take.
Well, let me sort of add one more thing real quick. I mean,
Yeah.
just because I'm saying this sort of, we'll talk about this more in a bit, but I mean, this happens all the time, is, me and some of my colleagues, we got very excited about things. Imagine having the first billion parameter model and it can do cool things. It can do things like, wow, you can get it to write like synthetic Wikipedia articles, something amazing like that. Like given the sources, it would write a 500-word Wikipedia stub at the top that was like kind of okay, So you're looking at that and no one's really done that before. And you think it's amazing. And it's easy to think, I certainly fell into this quite a bit. It's like, oh my God, it's not that long until, blah, blah, blah. You can do this. You can imagine all of these applications, right? But like, those applications took several years. The truth is until OpenAI did ChatGPT, no one was really that actively working on it. And still to this day, it hasn't exactly replaced human writing. The one place where the AI probably has replaced human work quite a bit is on the image generation side, but that maybe has a lot more to do with like, and that's actually not even that big of a model. And it just maybe has to do with us being lazy and we need illustrations and most of us aren't good enough to draw things. So
Yeah,
the truth is the point I'm saying is it's that's why you see all of this like hype and bust. And it's like, it's just very schizophrenic because when you see a technology, you immediately say, hey, it's going to do these amazing things. It's going to change the world. And it often does, but sometimes it doesn't at all. And sometimes it takes a lot longer, or maybe you show it and people don't believe it. So final thought is, for example, you see this with the AGI excited people. I mean, how many people do you know, especially on the young side, who like have been saying now for like maybe even 2 years, AGI is already here and that kind of stuff. You can sort of convince yourself, but it's obviously not true.
Many false positives, actually, or false starts or
That's right.
false alarms on that front, actually. So I will just really quickly, I'm in various group chats. I've heard various things and things I've heard people. I mean, in the fall of 2022, this is a real quote. I'm not going to say who this person is, but they, are like a Silicon Valley, like micro influencer. And, one of the group chats, they were just like, oh, they don't think humanity is going to be around in 6 months. This was like December 2022. We're still here a year and a half past that sell by date. Other people have been, I recently had a, it was like October 20th. I was having dinner with a friend and she was, this might be the last day. AI is coming tomorrow, they say at Anthropic or OpenAI or whatever, someone said that. Okay. So we're still here. So I'm at this point jaded and just like whatever about that stuff. I do want to ask you, I want to talk about how how you make an application on top of this backbone, like how you did Deep News. But before that, let me just ask you really quickly. So there's Suno that does music, Midjourney and Dolly and all these that do, Stable Diffusion or whatever that do the visual stuff. There are different types of AI than an LLM, which is the text stuff, right?
Yes. So they all have a text language component, actually.
Well, because there's a command prompt, right? So
say again.
Well, I mean, there's a command prompt, and then like that like propagates certain lyrics or whatever, right?
Well, I mean, the lyrics one really has a strong language component, but even the image one, I mean, you kind of have to describe an image, and it has to build a space which is sort of like, the point is it still operates the image somewhat through the text space. But yeah, the song one. By the way, that song that long song that plays for your other podcast, is that Suno generated?
Yeah, and a lot of people are really annoyed by it, but I don't know. I kind of like it. I mean, this is let's just say that there's very polarized responses. I did cut it down to 1 minute for the intro, but
Yeah, it's. I like the song. It definitely feels to me like a little bit Uncanny Valley though, because since you can't really quite tell, it's like you're like, wait, what's going on here? This song is like kind of keeps going, like Indian classical music or something. I can't tell.
yeah, I think we'll drop in a sample right here of the song so that people know what you're talking about.
Rise above the static, dissecting issues diplomatic. With mics in hand, they brave the storm of clashing views and norms transform.
And okay, like no, now we should be back. But yeah, I'll hopefully people know what Nikolai.
It reminds me of. I mean, I'm sure this was partly the intent. Is if you remember that scene from like whatever Midnight in Paris, one of those movies or whatever, when you go to like the the homeless poet, and you tell him, hey, like write me a poem about like this couple and use the word pineapple,
Yeah, no, that's very similar to what it's like. That's very similar to what I did. Yeah, so I mean, those are. I mean, look, I'm using it. I'm not like I bought like for one podcast that I did. I bought like some sample of from some library. I didn't do that with the Suno, although I was paying for Suno for a while just to. But then I got bored really quickly with making songs. I'm not like a songwriter. I will say real quickly. I do tell it to write a 1,000 word. I do tell Claude, and I think it's like O1, the newest one of ChatGPT, to write a 1,000 word essay about Indo-Europeans by Razib Khan. And it's still definitely like, people should still be paying for the subscription for what I write, because it's like, I'll put it like senior year of high school, but a good student, not a bad one. But still, it's very, very pedestrian. There's a riz in there that my writing has, and also like more details, more content. So it's still not up there. But you know what? They're not actually bad summaries. If you're like totally naive, they're okay getting you up to up to par. So some of this writing stuff is getting good. And then you have the visual stuff, which I don't. I do it sometimes. I use AI to do some of the images for my posts, and people don't often notice. So sometimes they do.
Yeah, I mean, I think images. People are just used to that style and they're okay with it. I mean, I think people are having a lot of fun with it these days. But anyway, we can go going with this conversation. But I think to bring it back a little bit, to bring back the weave, as our God likes to say, is it's you don't really know the development of these things, and as researchers, we get very excited. I'm sure the Suno people are thrilled once they got even like Suno 0.1 working, and they should be. But how far away is it in writing compelling songs? I mean, probably, you never know. I mean, maybe it's around the corner. Maybe it'll be a niche thing. Who the heck knows?
Yeah. So okay. So you have since we first started talking, you really gone through the whole process of. I mean, you're beyond an MVP. You have, if you go to deepnews.com with a Z, or get on your phone, you guys can check out what I'm saying. But you have an app, you have an application, you have something real that's going on, and basically the way I use it, because I don't understand it because I didn't develop it, is that there are like summaries of various news events that are happening. I often use it to actually search for something specific, and then I get the summarization off that. So these are kind of like based on the underlying distribution of stories, and you have rankings based on Twitter influencers and all sorts of other things as well that go into it. But it's basically using artificial intelligence to kind of like munch through the news and kind of digest it for you. That's one way I think of it. What did you learn though about how to create applications, how to actually build a business off this new technology that is very exciting, but we've only done a few things with it that I can see.
Yeah, I mean, when we started, I just wanted to see if we can do it because I know that we could. But as it went further along, we're like, hey, we can actually use this to replace something like the New York Times or like a newspaper, because I think it has some real advantages. The most obvious is that it's looking at a lot more sources, so it's going to be wider. faster. It can write articles when you sleep. But I think especially where the media has gone recently, it's just they're not just biased. It's kind of like you can't get the unbiased version, if that makes sense. So, for example, if I want to read about Fed policy, or I just want to know what's going on with the Fed policy, like the New York Times will give me that information, I guess, but I'm going to get it through like Paul Krugman's lens, and
Yeah.
and I literally can't get it in any other way. Whereas I kind of just want to see like, A, what's going on, and two, okay, what is everyone saying? What's sort of the, I guess the synthesis of it, right? And I think for whatever reason, the media has had a lot of difficulty with that. I mean, you saw that especially in the election, but a lot of other things also. So I think what's great about the AI is, again, it's fast. It looks at a lot of sources. It can look at things internationally. All of these things that humans really can't do. But I think in practice, it just generates better news in many ways. It gives you, yes, the personalization that you want, which is huge, but also it just gives you, nice, clean headlines that get to the point, which I think is a lot of people want, and they struggle to get that from the media. I mean,
Yeah.
Nobody that I know would even consider turning on notifications on their phone, for example, in a news app. And if they did, you would either get way too little or way too much. It's like you can, and you can build it to be great from a human perspective. I mean, Apple kind of does that with Apple News to an extent. It has a lot of human intervention. They do a pretty good job, but I think starting it with the AI is just sort of, the obvious way. Now, obviously, it sometimes writes bad headlines. Sometimes it misses important facts. Sometimes it misses context. It doesn't tie stories together. Generally speaking, the articles are quite short, although for bigger ones, especially with O1, it's now writing 3-4 paragraph articles that I think are quite good. But these things will improve. It's not like, I think it's more than useful now. I think it's very useful. In some areas, it lacks the context. Like people, correctly point out that some of the biology stuff, it's a little fuzzy on. Like the LLMs, we could sort of explain why. I think that has to do with the training data, but the LLMs are not very good at explaining or understanding biology. But that's going to improve.
And so they'll probably improve. So why not just? Well, actually, I kind of know, but let me just ask you: why not just use ChatGPT to query the news? Like they have a limit on their how late the data is and other things like that, right? Like how did you modify it? Like what did you find that you had to do?
Well, I think that's almost coming at it from like the wrong direction in a sense, right? Because and I think this is where people get stuck. They think, they just think procedurally. Well, I take A and I add it to B, and if the thing is super intelligent, it's just going to work. But we're actually building a fully fledged news service, which means we have to think about, okay, like you want to organize things by topics, you want to have top sources, you want to write things in this sort of article and headline format that people are used to. That therefore you can work on that. You can train it. You can deal with specific issues. Like a lot of times, a big story, like it's really easy to write top stories from a week ago. You have all the social proof, all the best sources, all the best explainers. And actually, if you see some of our competitors, that's like pretty close to what they do. As a demo, you can say, wow, we have great news. We have this great summary. Perplexity or someone in their demo will be like, we did a great job of explaining the OpenAI like Sam Altman drama from a year ago. It's like, great. No one's going to read about that today. But
that's not news. That's almost history.
It's history. Yeah. And they're a research company, so that makes sense for them to focus on that. They would be good at that. That's what you would expect. But news is sort of its own animal. And I think a lot of the stuff we do is really not qualitatively that difficult, but you have to think about it in terms of solving the problem. Like what do you want an actual fully fledged, fully automated newspaper to look at? Which means, it's going to be automated. You're not going to have humans making judgments. You're not going to have humans moving things around. You're not going to be like, have people propose things, and sure, if the problem was super easy, you could just feed in all the tweets and get all the answers. But for example, the chat interfaces, like a lot of people thought that we would just be going to GPT or custom GPTs or whatever and just asking questions all day. No one does that. I mean, they do it for some problems. I use it for some problems, but people aren't using it that much, especially now that the novelty has worn off. No one is going to ChatGPT and asking like, hey, what's happening in the Middle East? It's like not an experience that people want. People want to see stories and headlines and details and citations and sources. And, so that's you have to build it as a real product. And I mean, I would say 95% of the work is not the LLM writing the story.
Okay, because that's done for you so you are using right now an OpenAI API.
Yeah, or we can use a XAI Grok API, which we've been using a little bit. You'll see some of those stories. I mean, we can sort of swap it out for anything. But I mean, the general flow is not really that complicated. But you have to take all the sources. You have to sort of kick off these events either continuously or in some sort of clock, where you try to basically generate a hypothesis. Essentially, it says, okay, you have this cluster of people who are talking about something that may be related. Great, write a sample story and then evaluate. Is it newsy? Is it new? Is it interesting? If so, okay, great. Then put more of your resources into writing like a proper story. And then you have this, I mean, internally we call it deduplication. It's like a very like nerdy way of putting it, but really, just sorting, right? I mean, you're going to have, we write about 2,000 unique stories per day, maybe a little more now. But if you discounted the uniqueness, it's like 100,000 a day. Or something crazy like that. Like a lot of stuff is rejected because it's not newsy or not really a story, and a lot of things are, there's okay, we already wrote this, so is it a big enough update to write something new? Do you replace it? It's actually very difficult. Like all the time, even now, we'll have a really, really good version of a story, and then you check back 2 hours later, and then we replaced it with a version that's frankly worse sometimes. So the AI has to make that evaluation, and sometimes it makes a mistake.
So you're okay. So I'm looking at it. You said there's like 1,000 news stories that you're creating summaries for. This is just your small company.
You keep saying summaries. I think that's really kind of misleading. Like that's where I think people go wrong. They're like, take this and summarize it, But it's like, no, they're just writing stories, So
okay. So in comparison, New York Times has an average of 150 articles daily and about 65 blog posts. So
yeah, so we're magnitude bigger. We're like 2,000, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Well, because you're drawing from all these like ultimate, like the training data, or like all these different sources.
Yeah, we're looking at like more than 50,000 sources, and and across topics, and we've added a bit of an automatic translation, but we're going to do a lot more of that. So, for example, if you want coverage, in Spain or France or Brazil or whatever, I mean, you get decent coverage from the English language sources, but obviously you would have much better coverage if you took the best sources in those languages.
Yeah.
But by the same token, like, people are probably interested. What are they saying about America or about Trump in Japan? So you cover that as well. That's a little bit more of a niche, right? So yeah, I mean, something like the New York Times, which is the biggest news group. Okay, I didn't know that, but that makes sense. They're doing about 200 stories a day, roughly speaking. So we're doing an order of magnitude bigger.
Yeah.
Not a huge difference, but
noticeable. And you like rolled this all out like what, like it's a year and a half, 2 years?
No, I mean, really less than that. I mean, we've really only been live for about a year, maybe like a little bit longer as like a very crappy demo, but like as a product you can use, for about a year, a little bit less than that.
So Deep News is already a product. You already have that. Kind of like juxtaposed against that, I want to talk about, some people are talking about a plateau, like a plateau in performance or a plateau in AI right now. What do they mean by that? Like, what are the benchmarks?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it speaks to a very true thing, right? Which is that at best, even when, let's just say you have infinite data, right? And the model can scale to an infinite size. When things are very, like when you're in a very data rich environment, generally speaking, you would have like improvement in a linear metric grow at like, whatever, like the log or the square root or something like that, right? Like it's never of the model size.
Yeah.
Like it would never ever be linear. That's like impossible. So you had these so at a rough level, you had these sort of projections, and you can think of different X and Y scales. They don't really matter for a second, let's just think on even the very simple task of perplexity of basically predicting the next token, which obviously gets confusing, data quality and blah, blah, blah. But take something like that, like, for a while that just kept increasing, it's like if you have a bigger model, if you train for longer, or if you add more data, these were for a while, I guess the first popular version is something called the chinchilla rules, which is like from a Facebook paper, from a model people don't even use anymore. But this idea that you have to have these sort of three things, and this is how they scale. Well, the issue that people are pointing out is that we're getting to the point where adding more data or more compute isn't really helping, as much. Like just the curve is slowing down in these improvements. I think that is both true and somewhat misleading. I mean, I think you pointed out the metrics. The problem is ultimately we don't care about predicting the next token. We care about, solving real problems. And a lot of these human metrics have both been gamed and they get saturated. Once you're getting like 95%, you're really getting into an issue of, okay, are the examples labeled wrong? Did the model train on it, et cetera? So that's been a big issue for a while. Another metric people really liked for a while was this LMSys, where people put up their own questions. But it was relative. But now that's clearly was being gamed in both, on purpose and not. I think one would argue that the task we probably care more about is like real difficult problems that people face, but it's becoming like more difficult to collect those.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that artificial intelligence is supposed to do is put people out of work. Translators are having issues. Some illustrators are definitely having issues.
Right.
Yeah, I'm seeing the unemployment rate 4.1%, which is, I mean, that's what I was called. That was called full employment when we were kids. I mean, today we've had lower unemployment since the recovery from the 2010, and it's never really changed except for the one pandemic spike, but that was temporary and an aberration. So we have low unemployment, and this artificial intelligence is, cannibalizing some jobs we know, but hasn't seemed to have a major impact yet, which is not shocking to me, but some people,
Well, it hasn't been around for very long,
Yeah.
I mean, and yeah, I mean, that's kind of what you would expect with, I mean, so far, yes, it's acted very much like any other technology where it's going to be very disruptive in some sections. Overall, you don't really see it in the numbers, and over time, things change a lot. I mean, you look at, how much and Ben Thompson's favorite example, how much is something like Facebook transformed not just advertising, but like even businesses that get created, I mean, okay, and for a while it was online businesses. All these direct-to-consumer stuff was really created by Facebook in a sense, because you can, target different demographics. Famously, Dollar Shave Club was the first one, at least in sort of he's like, hey, you can advertise just to men of a certain age, certain income range, in certain cities. Like, great, and obviously even IRL businesses constantly do nothing but try to post on Instagram and tell you to not even to review them, but to post about them. So, I mean, these things have like weird and like longer, form factors. I mean, I think it's, it would both be, I think, silly to think that AI won't have a big influence on this. At the same time, like, why would that happen quickly? Except for, like you said, if your job is being an illustrator, okay, or GitHub, right? Not GitHub, the Stack Overflow, right? Like their traffic is down like 90%, right? Yeah, that makes sense. Stack Overflow, the website for, people fixing each other's coding problems.
Yeah. I have used it. I have to say, like, I still use it a little bit, but I've really switched over to Claude and O1 a lot. Actually,
and you're not really a full-time developer. Like all the developers I know pretty much use these tools a ton now.
Yeah. It's like it's part of our daily workflow, right? It's part of our. It's just like I can't imagine what it'd be like without it. So you asked about O1. I don't use O1 all the time. I use probably like half the time. I pay for it, but it's slower. Can you just like tell me? I mean, like obviously don't know what the difference really is in a technical sense. How is O1 better than ChatGPT 4.0?
So O1's a very interesting use case because that's where I think a lot of these things come up. We've been talking a bit abstractly, but I think it's good to get into the details, at least on a specific example. So O1, when it came out, it was supposed to be like this great model. It's going to be a lot more expensive, and I'll explain why in a second. But it's supposed to be a lot better. And it launches on LMSys. At first, it has like a score that's like not shockingly higher, but was significantly higher than GPT 4.0. And then people voted it down to like below GPT 4.0. I think somewhat on purpose, but somewhat like, yes, on a lot of queries, it's not noticeably better, as you're somewhat pointing out, and it's much slower. Now, what I do still think it's potentially a transformational technology for us story writing. It makes a very big difference. But let's just talk about what it does. So the problem is this we've had this like long-term problem for years now with the LLMs, where the way they're trained is they're just predicting the next word, and they write the next word, and this is a very linear process, right?
Yeah.
The problem with this is that if you make a mistake, you can't fix it. That's really the problem. So you can alleviate this with a million different tricks. Obviously, the most obvious is beam search. They don't actually write a word. They sort of do like a look ahead, and they sort of find the best sort of, multi-step thing, right? Kind of like almost you would think of us as humans. We probably do some look ahead as well when we're walking or going somewhere or driving,
Yeah.
like thinking a little bit ahead. You know what I mean? But still, you're kind of taking irreversible actions, like when we're having a conversation right now. We can't go back and edit it. That just wouldn't really make any sense. Like
Yeah.
the whole thing. But when you write, when you write an article, you do that. You write a draft and then you edit it and you show it. Maybe you come back later, you think about it again, you change it, right? So,
Yeah.
so the how they implemented it is almost not that important. What is important is that they gave the model this ability, because of course you can engineer it yourself. We've been doing that with Deep News for quite some time.
Yeah.
From the very beginning, what we've done is do this sort of chain of thought kind of stuff. We've been doing that from the very beginning, where even with GPT 3.5, you would have it write the original version of the article, and you're like, hey, like rewrite it with this thing, like find the salient facts, right? Because think about writing an article. Perfect example. It makes like logical sense to write the headline first, but when you finish writing the article, you may want to change the headline because actually, as you got into the details, you want these things to match. So already before ourselves, we had a prompt chain where we would sort of rewrite 2 or 3 cycles. The problem is this has problems. You can't rewrite it 10 times. It actually gets super weird. So we found that was to rewrite it 2 or 3 times, but we had to sort of essentially do this. The idea with O1 is to essentially at a high level do that internally. So it figures it out. It makes more sense for the model to be trained to do that on its own. That's fundamentally why it takes longer. You can think of it as rewriting things. You can think of it as using, looking in 2 directions as opposed to just linearly only, but yes, on a lot of problems where, especially on easy problems, you don't really need it. It's not necessarily better. And also the other thing is how do they necessarily generate the right training data, right? It's not that obvious how the rewriting should happen. That's something we have literally no training data at all. So they had to do some work. Some people will give more abstract ways. They'll say, oh, you give it like thinking tokens. It basically can just, and at some level this is true, just by having a bigger budget for certain answers that matter more, you can sort of like think harder, right? The classic example is you give it this complicated math equation and you're like, give us the answer. Well, if it just gives you the answer, it's not thinking very hard. Whereas if you work through the problem, you're essentially giving it a bigger compute budget to solve the problem. So even like very simple instructions like that were helpful, but obviously being more structured around it, giving it examples of solving problems, simulating that, et cetera, makes a whole lot of sense. So I think O1 was actually a pretty big success for complicated tasks. Like again, now it's writing 3-4 paragraph articles for us, which are like massively more intelligent. It's making fewer mistakes. It's taking something. This is an example. You'll have a bunch of tweets about like the polls during the election, say like the last week, and are the polls good for Kamala or not, right? And you would see a bunch of tweets, and it would synthesize that into like a very nice 3-4 paragraph thing that was accurate, intelligent, tied well together. So I think before a system like that, you couldn't do that. But if you're not asking it to do that, like to your point, for 1,000, for 1,000 words, or even for 200 words, I think O1 you would expect it to do a much better job than GPT 4.0.
Yeah.
But it's not as polished, right? GPT 4.0 is being polished, so that's like closer to its optimal, whereas O1 is like probably like extremely not optimized.
Wait, do you guys use Claude at all for Deep News? Just out of curiosity.
We've experimented with it, I think. And again, on our specific use case, it's weird. So the first model, I forget which one, Sonnet 3, whatever. The first one that was like beating GPT on LMSys, which is a bit slow and very expensive, was very good. And then the next one, which was faster, people liked it for coding. I thought was actually very bad at writing news articles, but mainly because his default tone was like too chatty. It was like turning everything into like a Reddit post. And I'm like, that's not what we want. By the way, we give it the same instructions. We ask, the articles to be written in a factual and sort of, like an objective manner, kind of like in a style of something like Bloomberg, et cetera. And it just wasn't able to follow that instruction for whatever reason. So I think as we saw, we've seen quite a bit of differentiation there, specifically between GPT and Claude, where they'll start optimizing for different things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Claude optimized for code. I think a lot of people who code like it. But even for GPT, like the version that you're getting in the sort of user interface is different in the version I'm getting in the API, and I can't tell you why, but
Yeah.
I know that it's different.
Well, I will tell you guys, tell you listeners out there, when Claude tries to, or GPT tries to write like me, it's a more pedestrian, straight ahead, fact rich essay than Claude, which is much more writerly. I don't know why.
Yeah, it's kind of bullshitty. Yes.
Yeah, Claude has lower data density in its responses, but it seems more like that would be something I write, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
So,
it's like more conversational, which can be good, but I think for us is like not good at all. You know, you would
yeah,
take very serious topics and it would almost like try to make fun of them. So
yeah. So,
yeah.
there's been all sorts of things that have happened over the last couple of years, and I want to talk about some of them in terms of what's going on. This guy like Leo Aschenbacher, I think.
Leopold, the interview.
Brenner, he wrote something called, he follows me on Twitter. I should have him on to explain, but he wrote something called situational awareness for OpenAI, and then he's basically fired from OpenAI, and he was like on all these podcasts, like Dorkesh's podcast, and it somehow got to Donald Trump, and he alluded to situational awareness. There have been arguments about whether, look, I haven't listened to the whole thing, but Dario Amodei of Anthropic has like a 5-year roadmap or 4-year roadmap about AGI and all this stuff. This is like percolating into the policy sphere. Elon Musk, who is let's just call him the first friend, right now, he's very involved in policymaking in the Trump world, and he is a little bit of what we would call a decel. He had a famous falling out with OpenAI, mostly because he thought Sam Altman and crew were, well, it was a nonprofit. They were going to turn it into a profit, obviously, and he's executed on that now. Sam Altman's pushed everyone else out since we last talked. It's just him. And anyway, so we have someone who has opinions on artificial intelligence, Elon Musk, at the center of power, right? So we've been talking about this as technology. We've been talking about this private sector, but there is a national security geopolitical aspect. Looks like China and the United States are the ones that are really producing these models, these LLMs, that are pushing the frontier of artificial intelligence. And are you worried? You're in the field as a business owner. You're looking for partnerships. Like you're getting some visibility, so you have to like get a general sense. Are people worried about the government getting involved? And I will tell you, I have heard people in Bay Area tell me. I'm not gonna like say who it is, but like someone who's like not an unserious person told me that the Trump administration was thinking about trying to nationalize OpenAI. Okay, I'm just gonna say that was something else, and I was like, how would you even do that? There are some laws, there are some things that you could probably try, but why pick OpenAI? Why not pick Anthropic? There's just all sorts of questions, and it seems to me, okay, this is what I'm gonna say. For a couple of years, I just want the government to keep its nose out of it. That's my opinion, because I don't think people understand what's going on. On the other hand, some people might say like that's very naive, and maybe like we could create some monstrosity, and it'll be like what is that? Mila Jovovich is in those series. Resident Evil, like some evil corporation could create some monster, artificial intelligence monster. Maybe some people would say that. But anyway, I've been talking for a while. What do you think about that in terms of policy people, the government, and laws getting involved in artificial intelligence?
Yeah, as you can tell from what you're saying, it's all very abstract, right? That's the main thing. Is I've never seen something with as much fluff and buzzwords as this whole discussion. Not, but at the same time, I think it's also inevitable. I think even if it's just the next technology, as you can see, the government will meddle in the technology. It sort of is what it is. I think that's not something.
Because a big deal, the government's going to get involved.
100%. And I think being a libertarian about it isn't going to change anything. I think the government will get involved. I think at the same time, people will do their thing. I think both can be sort of forces that are true at the same time, is sort of a yin yang kind of thing, right? The government tries to ban NVIDIA chips, so people just sneak them in their luggage, and
yeah,
the government tries to censor things so they get other stuff. Like it's just I think the government can encourage and discourage things, suppress them to some extent, but I think completely dictating is like it's not competent enough to do that, right? But at the same time, of course, it's going to have some sort of policy, right? And I think it can and it should be at some sort of federal level. Like, to change the focus from AI for a second, as part of some of the election stuff, I mean, you saw states on both sides, both like very blue states and very red states, try to like push legislation to regulate like Facebook at the state level, and it's like what are you doing? It's not going to happen. It's not going to work. Like even doing it at the national level is already challenging enough. But like, okay, so different states are going to have like different. That's just not where we're going, And I'm not against localism at all, but it just doesn't really make sense for Idaho to have different Facebook laws than New York.
Yeah,
it's just kind of a little bit silly. So I think
it is silly because they're in cyberspace. They're not like physical space.
And no one really thinks of them as different places, Like once you're online, you're online. So when you're in a different country, when you go to Argentina and you use the internet, you are aware that you're maybe like in a different space and it's not quite the same internet, But if you cross the border from California to Nevada and the rules change, like unless we're talking about online gambling, it doesn't really make sense.
Yeah.
So I think it's good that the government has people who are just technically competent, I think that's a good thing. I think I also know a bunch of AI policy people just socially. I have no idea what they're doing. I find their reading to be very complicated and fluffy as well, even though they do this for a living.
Yeah.
So I think that there's it's a little bit putting the cart before the horse, right? I mean, the stuff doesn't, to your point, hasn't really transformed the economy, except, putting a few very specific sectors kind of down 90%. And, that is going to happen with any technology. So,
yeah, I mean, we're gonna go through multiple hype cycles. I feel like we're not like on the downswing. Like we're not having like think pieces like, oh, AI has been a bust, because it hasn't. I mean, I think, as we already said, it's already impacted our lives, and we're not like that atypical in terms of just using it in our day to day. You've created a business with it. There are other people. I mean, I know other people personally who have created various businesses. Usually, they're like chatbots, assistants, like these sorts of things.
I mean,
yeah.
And here's the question. I mean, is it like, are any of them really making big money? I mean, we know the answer. They're not. I mean, there's a few small exceptions. So look, in that way, I think the most obvious analogy is to the chip industry, So, have you read Chip Wars?
Yes.
Very good book. I think a lot of your readers have. If not, I would highly recommend it. With the one recommendation that read the second half first, because otherwise you're going to be stuck in a lot of interesting stories from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, which are awesome, but like don't have that much bearing on today. But anyway, great book. And actually, if you look at those stories, I mean, all of these fledgling chip companies, when they were interesting, I mean, they were constantly going out of business and running out of money, running to the government, doing deals, having international stuff with Japan at the time. So I think a lot of these stories are actually kind of familiar if you look at it, right? Where if you look at these companies, it's obviously a huge industry. These companies are worth a lot. None of them are like printing cash really, partly because they're in competition. I mean, even OpenAI and Anthropic are like still losing money. Doesn't mean we wouldn't all, line up to give them money as shareholders, but it's just one of those things where it's still, and I think that's probably why, the government is going to have some hand to play. Like it's a very weird market where even as a new entrant, you basically have to throw a lot of money at it to be competitive. Mm-hmm. But, but like to be competitive in an industry that like, frankly doesn't even make money. Like for example, TikTok spend billions of dollars to break into the social media game.
Yeah.
But that is a very profitable business. Now, you can argue whether they did it for the money or for the clout, but they're making a lot of money through ads now, like a tremendous amount.
Yeah.
Whereas in AI, like it's almost like fair to say that the refrain is NVIDIA is the only company that makes any money on AI, and so far that has been true. Like NVIDIA is making all the money basically. Maybe some of the server companies, but certainly not the downstream. But it's okay because it's early. So they're fighting for market share, and I mean it's worked out very well for OpenAI. I mean at this point, Claude can release a better model, and it wouldn't really matter. They're not going to really cut into OpenAI's market share. I mean,
we've talked about this, really the artificial intelligence current hype cycle, current era has only really produced one brand name that the public recognizes, and that's OpenAI. That's ChatGPT.
That's
Like,
right.
nerds like us know Anthropic and all these other companies,
With,
but
with one caveat, So if you look at and I wish I had the chart, but if you, again, like Claude and GPT have really kind of forked a bit, which is always going to happen when you have sort of close competitors. Almost through randomness, they end up focusing on different things, and you end up with like, one company's making like a Saturn and one company's making a Volvo, almost through like randomness, right? Like they find different pockets, right? And so ChatGPT OpenAI is completely dominant in the consumer space, but Anthropic is very competitive in the API space. So their API revenue is something like half of OpenAI's, which is great. Whereas their consumer revenue is like 1/1000th of OpenAI's, like basically zero. So
okay.
we've kind of fallen into this thing where probably largely because of the developers and the vibes, they have. I would say yes. While most people in the public have heard of ChatGPT, they have not heard of Anthropic and they haven't heard of Perplexity. I think on the sort of API developer user side, I mean, Anthropic is. I mean, it's the more famous, it's the more popular one in Berkeley, but it's also just well known among developers.
Yeah, and like Perplexity, you mentioned Perplexity. A lot of listeners are not going to know what Perplexity is. Can you tell them what that is?
Yeah, so Perplexity also started pretty early on. They were doing a bunch of other things before, but basically where they've settled into is they are sort of the Google competitor as a search engine. So it's just an AI search engine. That's all it really is. It actually licenses their results from Google, which some people think is like a big gotcha, but it's not. Basically, it's taking very similar results, top 30 results from Google, and organizing in a very different way. I use it, you use it, a lot of people we know use it, and it's good for, I wouldn't say I would use it all the time, but for like researchy type queries, they do give responses, generally speaking, that are better than Google.
Yeah.
At least in some cases, and some people like the UI and they have a nice app. And they're getting into more stuff, but that's the main thing. But I mean, I tried to find their search volume traffic on just like stats in the US, and it's like it doesn't even register. Neither does Search GPT. So then OpenAI basically tried to compete directly with Perplexity. And I mean, when's the last time you heard someone even mention that? So all of these search competitors, they're there, but they haven't really made anything closely resembling to Dent and Google. Now, obviously, Google has started using a lot more AI in their searches, which I think recently has gotten better. Like I've been having some lower back problems, some sciatica, and I've been Googling about that a lot. And I think Google has started doing a better job of surfacing like good Reddit threads and pulling out answers and things like that. And would they have done that if not for competition from Perplexity? I don't know. Maybe not.
Yeah,
But
I mean,
I think their problem is, again, as you said, ChatGPT launched at the right time with the right product, really hit the thing, and developed a consumer brand that is still popular, even if people don't use it much. I'm sure many people are like me, have the consumer $20 a month and like never use it, which is
I don't. Yeah, and I don't like. I mean, I don't drink Coke or Pepsi very much, but I know them. It's at that stage where if you do know something about AI and you're just an average civilian, you can blurt out that name. That's
exactly. You may not use Head and Shoulders either, but if someone's like, hey, here's a bunch of shampoos with you're in Thailand and they have crazy like lettering on them, you might take the Head and Shoulders, right? I mean, same as you may drink a Coke even if you don't normally drink Coke, but you're like, I don't know what the hell these other things are. Exactly. So I think Perplexity tried. I mean, this is just my outside analysis. They tried to get some sort of foothold in the consumer search space, and I'm not sure they've made much progress. But I think the product's pretty good.
Yeah. So I guess like I want to close kind of back with deep news, and as you're developing it, look, I mean, your startup, compute's always an issue. The underlying models are changing somewhat because I'm assuming you didn't initially start out with 0.01.
Well, no, we started with the GPT 3.5 because that was the only thing available.
Yeah.
No, look, we've written that way. I mean, that part is improved, and you knew that from the beginning.
Yeah.
But I think look, I mean, I'll tell you the main thing that we're dealing with now, which I mean, you know this, but the issue is awareness, right? We have the same issue essentially as Perplexity and everybody else, which is that people have heard of the New York Times, or they've even heard of of X or Twitter, even if they're not. We love X, but I mean, it's a confusing place to get your news because you get the whole everything.
Yeah.
But yeah, of course, like, we don't have a brand, and I think there have been a few news aggregators, which I guess we sort of are and sort of are not, that have developed their own brand, but not that many, right? Like Drudge was big for a while until they went bad. Tech Meme is sort of a thing, So I think there's just a lot of, I think that we are, trying to figure out how to, how to reach people as a consumer product. Because I think the product is better than people think. It's quite compelling as is. Not even to mention, the obvious.
Yeah, it adds value. I mean, I think it adds value. I mean, I'm biased, but like I think it definitely adds value. And so, we're talking about the AI revolution. We kind of went on abstract. I pushed into abstract layer sometimes, but the reality is it's here. There are products that people are using. The people are using your product. There's other things related to translation services. I mean, that's just like a gimme that people are using. I know that Colin Wright, Reality Last Stand, I mean, he had an editor. He got rid of an editor. He just uses GPT now to fix things,
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, and look, and again, I mean, not knowing Colin at all, I can imagine why. The reason is probably not the cost. It's probably not even the quality. It's like, hey, this editor, like, you don't have to email somebody. Like, they're not going to be late.
Convenience.
And consistency, right? So I remember when I was at Google 20 years ago, the head of search, Amit Singhal, he would always, one of the things he would always say to the group was, okay, if there was like a, the Mechanical Turk, the man inside the machine,
yeah,
better job ranking the results. But we're going to do this fast and consistently. And that's it. And that was worth doing, and it still is. So I think, look, I mean, I think to sum some of this stuff up, for the famous, Churchill quote, right? I mean, this is the end of the beginning. This is still early. We're seeing some great companies and definitely a few very popular niche products. A lot of very useful tools. I think I'm not a fan of destroying old great businesses like Stack Overflow, but I think it is showing that some things, are better and are being replaced. And then we'll see. I mean, this will take years. And along the way, I think the part that I'm excited about is really, that second stage of a new technology where you start doing things you couldn't imagine before. Right now, still mostly, hey, AI is better at this than this other thing. And I think the one case we've seen where it's a thing we didn't know we needed is obviously the image generation. We didn't know we needed to generate all these images and illustrate our pictures. I mean, we sort of had it, but it's different now. The vibe is completely different. You're not like, ooh, I'm getting rid of my Illustrator. It's like, now I can just add little pictures to make my point. But that's pretty small. I mean, it's not nothing, but imagine if Suno wrote amazing songs and you just want to listen to them all day long. I mean, it wouldn't be about replacing your Spotify. It would be like a new experience. And in that way, I mean, do I think we're there with deep news? I mean, maybe not, but I certainly, I like the autoplay in the morning now. Instead of listening to a podcast or something like that, I'll just press play and it'll just start reading me news stories, and I pause when I find it interesting. Maybe at times I wish I'd dragged it out a little bit more, but it's an interesting way to start the day.
Yeah, I mean, it's just these sorts of tools, these sorts of apps, they're kind of conveniences that slowly, like step by step, kind of like scaffold our daily just experience of life. And we don't even, I feel like, a couple of years from now, even 5 years from now, there's gonna be all these sorts of things, and we're not gonna think about it. We're not gonna second guess it. It's gonna be part of our lives. And I think one of the
well, flipping through TikTok, right? Like, I don't use TikTok. I refuse. But
Yeah.
I guess I get the same experience through YouTube and Instagram. And like, I don't know, YouTube especially, it's you'll go and you'll start flicking through things for 10 minutes. I didn't know I wanted that.
Yeah.
People want it. If it was banned, like Google would fight against the ban because they'll go somewhere else. And you have people who emerge like, who's the imam that answers questions I
I forget his name, but he's really funny.
Yeah, he's great.
He gets really like dumb Zoomer questions,
and he's sort of yelling at them. It's like a comedy routine.
It's like, man, what do you think? What are you asking that for? It's like he'll be like, "Is it halal to eat pig in a game? Pork in a game?" And he's like, "What? It's a game." It's like, what?
No. I think for that one, he was like, well, like he's like, look, if it just enters you for your character, just go ahead and do it. Don't overthink it. But he's
Yeah,
like, you love pig, so now you want to go and order a bacon cheeseburger. Of course, that's haram, you know.
yeah. Yeah, that sort of stuff is funny.
It's great. And again, kind of like the companies that got created around Facebook, you have these personalities and media styles and like really language that's being created around the internet and TikTok, right? So I think AI has had some influence on that for sure, but it's like still early stages, right? And in that way, I don't blame people. So I'm obviously not a doomer, but I don't think their concerns are insane, right? Like it is going to transform the society, and maybe we should be like the Amish. And what do they say, right? The Amish aren't against society; they just technology. They just sort of like go one by one, like, do we want this one or not? And individual communities make different choices, and maybe that's what people want. Maybe, I mean, you see this in Japan, right?
Yeah,
Like Japan is very advanced and very technological in some ways and not others, but they explicitly as a society like decide they want certain things done not by machine, even though they can. I don't know how they reach these conclusions. I would be very interested to find out.
yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, I'm as excited as I think I am I am as excited about this technology as when I first talked to you. I definitely less I don't know if I was a doomer, but I mean, I'm a little bit more skeptical of a lot of the doomer stuff, and I can't like put a finger on why, but I think it's just
Well, they haven't
because
had a good record. I think
yeah,
listening to them for 2 or 3 years, I think eh, it's I think generally people have trended away from them for good reason. And also, here's the thing: like it's the same reason that all the people who like hate Elon are going to lose in the long run. It's just not the American way. Being a hater is not very American.
yeah,
So like it's not an accident that people like Gary Marcus, who at one point maybe did some useful things, I don't really know, but like just being a hater and shouting at clouds is just not fun. It's not interesting.
yeah,
It's not even that entertaining, unlike the Imam, who's very entertaining.
yeah, yeah.
So
All right, yeah. He is entertaining. It's that's a definitely like interesting spin off of like what these new technologies are doing too in terms of kind of like the traditionalist. I mean, there's all these things that we have part of our culture, and they're being reborn in different ways by the internet. They have been by the internet, and now the internet, and now you have artificial intelligence, and I'm gonna end here, but it's just like 2,500 years ago with alphabetic writing, which like allowed like much cheaper writing and like writing plays and all these other things easily. Uh, that was a big discussion point in places like ancient Greece. Like, how is that going to transform how we think and how we operate in the world? And it did transform how we thought and how we operated in the world. I mean, it wasn't bad like some people thought, but it was a change. And so I think this is like, to me, like I feel like this is similar. Okay, yeah, there's going to be a lot of jobs that are going to get destroyed. I think that that's just reality, but I can see it myself. I can see jobs that are like I don't see the point of that now or something. But like the unemployment rate is still really low, so people are getting new jobs. It's just like the magic of economics is still
well,
working.
especially in America, I mean, it's just a lot more dynamic, right? I mean, obviously, you do have still some familial things, like being a funeral director. Apparently, you're sort of in that caste, or you're not, even in America. Like no one starts a new funeral home. It's always someone you inherit from your relatives. And there's many jobs like that, but I think most people in America, I mean, what are the stats? They change careers like 4 or 5 times, and people do all kinds of different things. So, yeah, as usual, don't bet against American dynamism.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. Well, we're closing out 2024. I will talk to you again in 2025 for sure to see where we are. Hopefully, I'm kind of liking this pace a little bit because there's nothing crazy that's super disruptive, and there's just like new technologies and uses that are coming up. We had outside of the LLM, like the standard LLMs with the text, we have like Suno, we have Midjourney, we have all these companies and all these people doing things.
It's diversified and is definitely slowed down for sure. And in that way, I think that the whole like that's where when we started. I don't think that the people talking about the slowdown are completely wrong. I think there's truth to what they're saying.
Yeah.
I think like the fact that these metrics are like not helpful, or you can even imagine on some questions the O1 versus the GPT-4 cost 1,000 times less is the same. Like it does suggest that we're not just going up into the right the way we were, but it doesn't mean that there isn't a huge amount of progress. It's just going to happen at a different pace with different stuff, and like we could be in a little bit of a local plateau. But I agree with you. The slowing down, I think, is good, and I think it's reassuring. I think it's overall a good thing, but it just also just is. So
Yeah.
now sort of calm down and think about like, oh, like, is AI actually going to be helpful here, or maybe it's not. I think something that happened with a lot of my friends in Silicon Valley, a lot of the more pessimistic type people, they thought that AI was going to ruin their companies. You take a company like Asana or something like that.
Uh-huh.
They were like, okay, we're gonna like have half of our engineers work in AI, and
Okay.
because we have to, right? Or it's and I think a lot of those more crazy overreactions have been sort of petering out, which I think is probably good.
Mm.
Companies should probably do what they're doing, and keep abreast of this and use it where it's useful, and not really worry about that everything's going to be disrupted tomorrow.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, on that note, I will let you go, and we will check in 2025. Just for people finding you on the internet, I'll link to your Twitter, but obviously Deep News. You got that site that's your main project, your baby right now. So check that out, everybody. And it's been great talking to you and just keeping up on this field. And I do think it is important for people to understand what's happening because it is going to affect our lives in this next generation a fair amount.
Yeah, I think so. And then maybe next time we can take some questions ahead of time. I'm curious what people are thinking. I think
Sure.
that could,
Yeah, that's a good idea. All right. I'll talk to you later.
all right, take care.
This podcast for kids. This is my favorite